So if we look real quick in Columbine, we obviously mentioned that Harrison-Klebold really studied their history on events and copied Cahoe from the Bath, Michigan event on May 18th in 1927. I would encourage you to research that yourself. We're not going to go deep into anything that went right or went wrong as far as explosives and things like that in a public forum. So I definitely encourage you to research that yourself. In the end, if you look at the right, this is taken out of their notebooks there. That is them, Harrison-Klebold, skipping class and doing a head count on how many people were in the cafeteria at each lunch. And at the very end of that, kind of hard to see probably, it says 1114 to 1115. They estimated it at 500 plus students. If we look at the day that they attacked on April 20th, we'll see that there was actually 488 students in that lunch period. So their pre-planning, their intel was fairly accurate. When we look at the handwritten document right below the video, that was actually one of the last things they put in there. And it says, walk in, get bombs fed at 11:09, set them for 11:17, leave, drive to Clemente Park, gear up, get back by 11:15, park car, set car bombs for 11:18, get out, go to Outside Hill and wait until first bombs go off, attack, and have fun. So with that, they placed their bombs in that cafeteria, waiting for them to go off before they would attack. Who were they going to attack? They weren't going back into school. They were actually waiting for the fire alarms to get pulled, which they would have gone off anyways, with the explosion, and they knew where all the teachers were going to be evacuating the kids to, just like a fire drill. They were going to walk around out there and wreak their havoc on that. The deal with them is they had no plan B, plan C, etc. The other point I want to bring out on this is not that it's wrong, but we need to use the right examples. Is first responders need to be very cautious when responding to these type of events, Columbine, Boston, things like that, with the use of explosives, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that TTP by our enemy coming out in the future, and we need to be prepared for secondary, tertiary explosives that are aimed at first responders to take those assets out of the game. The problem is many times experts point to Columbine as an example of that, right? The car bombs were meant to take out the first responders. If we look at their own notes and their game plan that they said there, we realize that the original bombs in the school were going to go off at 11:17. Their car bombs were going to go off at 11:18. So how many first responders, after the initial bombs go off, people are oriented enough to know that something's going on, call 911, dispatch you? How many of us will be there within 1 minute of the first explosions going off? And I would say very few, right? And so in the end, those weren't aimed at us at all. There was an open school, there was kids outside, there were kids in the parking lot coming back from lunch. Obviously, on their entry point when the bombs didn't go off, they waited a little bit, came in, they were firing rounds, killed a child on their way in. So there's kids outside. That's what that was meant for. It wasn't meant for first responders, obviously. So we need to keep kind of things in perspective and manage that message of what's going on. So with that, realize this is kind of the example I gave as far as confined space, structural collapse. What is our response to this? Not many people from coast to coast are training when they trained for Columbine, training for what was actually supposed to happen in Columbine. They trained for an unrehearsed, unplanned event that happened ad hoc because their plan A didn't work. They had no plan B. They were very, very confident in their skill sets to do what they did. There's actually videos of them in Rampart Range taken prior to this event when they were training that they would videotape of them setting up smaller explosives, shooting the guns that they took with them into this event. Why did they copy the issue with Bath, Michigan? Well, to this date, Bath, Michigan, May 18th, 1927, is the largest school massacre that has ever occurred. It was because of explosives. We know Cho has stepped into that record-holding thing for a firearm, yet to this date, which we don't hear, the largest school massacre ever, 44 dead, Bath, Michigan, 1927. They thought they were going to take that spot from him, and that is why they did what they did. Those that are in EOD and have studied this event know the similarities of how they copied and what they did. So just because it didn't happen doesn't mean we shouldn't train for it, because a lot of kids out there know exactly what's supposed to go on. Unfortunately, we kind of turn a blind eye or don't research it enough to figure that out.
And fine. And my God, the window went out. And the kid standing there with me, I think he got hit. We got help on the way, ma'am.
So we start off, it's 11:27 at the bottom of that. Right there, 11:27, we saw the teacher, Sanders, running up the stairs there at the beginning. There's Harris trying to shoot at the bombs. We see Klebold going up, trying to set them off. He actually gets a cricket, lights it off, and sets the bags on fire. And that's when you see the flames come up and the sprinkler system start up and put the flames down. Now it's 11:45. So they've been in there about 20 minutes. That's Klebold throwing them there.
My son is Eric Harris, and I'm afraid that he might be involved in the shooting at Columbine High School.
There's where the bags get lit up.
He's a member of what they're calling the Trench Coat Mafia.
Have you spoken with your son today, Mr. Harris?
Well, I haven't. Have they picked up anybody yet? Or
They're still looking for suspects. Your son is with who? What gang?
well, they're calling them the Trench Coat Mafia. I just heard that term on TV.
See Harris and Klebold start talking with each other. They've already shot at kids, shot at an SRO. There's already a law enforcement response, and I think the time there is 12:05. So the video was kind of cut through, starting at 11:27. So in that time period, they basically were trying to get those bombs to go off any way they can, didn't, and made the decision that they were going to go through the school and do a modified plan. Most of us don't really remember Bailey, Colorado, for a couple reasons that we'll talk about here in a second. Bailey's vitally important. What happened at Platte Canyon, September 27, 2006, was actually the emergence of fortification within our dynamic responses that our threat is doing, coming up with ways to slow law enforcement down of getting in. In this specific room in 206 at this high school, the door that was unable to go into lockdown didn't have a lock on that door, but also it was only one door that went in and out of that room. It was on the second floor. I'm not going to get too far into this, but realize that the key to this is multifold. One is this was the kind of tipping point for fortification that we'll see happen in rapid succession after this, with the purpose of slowing down law enforcement so the threat can finish what they were doing, enact whatever last-minute carnage they can, and take their own life, taking all the power out of law enforcement and holding all that power to themselves. In the end, this was kind of a horrific event that you should definitely research, that involved a lot of specific things that were very, very demented. But he held eight girls, all blondes. Emily Keys at that point was a blonde. After time, he was letting some of them go. At the end, he basically had Emily and a foreign exchange student with him when an explosive entry was made after many hours. It was a SWAT response in a case like this, because he was basically kind of came in as not a really active shooter, but he did shoot as soon as he came in at the wall, which keyed the secretary to make the first 911 call. Went up there, and it kind of became more of a hostage-y type barricade situation. The law enforcement response to this, those guys are incredible, did a great job. They have a phenomenal AAR that they did at the event that really lays it all out. To see the constraints they were under, they did a great job. So with this, the key points to remember on this was, yes, it's kind of that tipping point for fortification. This is why it should always be in our mind, because we're going to see people copy this and evolve from this in rapid succession after this event. We also need to think about a couple key things without getting too deep into this. As soon as that explosive entry was made on a door with a cross charge and a kind of a mouse hole through the drywall to try and triangulate on the threat, foreign exchange student made a run for it, and Morrison tried shooting her, missing, was able to do a headshot on Emily and then kill himself prior to law enforcement getting any effective rounds on him. What he ended up doing was stacking the tables and chairs up. Law enforcement didn't know that occurred, so as they made entry, they were confronted with basically walls of desks and chairs, unable to get an accurate shot onto the threat and see what's going on. So what's interesting about this that needs to really our take home on this is at the same time across quite a few states over in Pennsylvania, there was a threat making plans to do a very, very similar MO on a school at that same point. He was able to watch 24-hour news, research on the internet, find out what this Morrison did, be able to do his own kind of AAR on him, what he did right, what he did wrong, study what he did, and evolve. And 5 days later, he executed the nickel mines event. So October 2nd, 5 days after the Platte Canyon, on the right is his hand notes of what he needed to take with him. And you'll see everything from tape, eye bolts, tools, KY jelly, bullets, guns, etc. that he took with him. He evolved on his fortification and evolved his TTPs in 5 days. If we look at how many law enforcement departments out there and fire departments that would respond and EMS agencies, how many of us could actually change and evolve our TTPs in 5 days? And everybody's probably laughing. It just doesn't happen, right? It takes months and months and months. In your larger departments, it takes even longer. So when we look at these events, it's not good enough that we can solve the problem for the last event that we heard in the media. We've got to be able to have our TTPs be able to evolve and project future capabilities that the threat will have, and that we will need to be able to breach that gap operationally with our TTPs and skill sets. So when we look at that, there's a lot of similarities between Platte Canyon. He evolved as far as his fortification. He actually took 2x2s and 2x4s in there, closed the plantation type shutters, and was able to secure these boards behind the shutters, keeping law enforcement out. He put flex cuffs onto the doors to also keep them out. There were some heroes in here on the atrocities that he did while he had those children in there. He kept 10 girls in this one because the last guy 5 days earlier kept 8. So he kept more. They're between the ages of 6 and 13. And when he began firing, he fired 13 rounds in 8 seconds, and it took law enforcement 2.5 minutes to make entry. No one's thinking, I need to bring a breaching tool, right? Everyone's thinking threat elimination, right? Move to the sound of the gun, move to the sound of the gun. So when we think about our force-on-force training that we do within law enforcement, we may have live role players inside with simunition, or however we do that on a Milo range or on any kind of FAT simulation or something like that. And that job that we drill into them is go to the sound of the gun. And that makes the assumption that we're going to be able to walk right inside that door. And that is not the truth any longer, not just because of fortification, but also because of lockdown procedures, and also because of schools having doors automatically lock in elementary levels in a high percentage from nationwide. So when we look at this, it becomes very, very problematic. So we have 2 events that occurred in 5 days that required law enforcement a breaching capability. Fast forward 6 months, we've got Virginia Tech. Cho studied them and evolved from them. So from a fortification standpoint, we need to realize that he upped it and went to chains and padlocks, which were very, very successful to the point where entry was not made on any of those. It was eventually made on a maintenance room door to a machine room, which Cho had no access to and thus did not chain and padlock. To answer some of the questions that we brought up, I think on the second slide, as far as being students of the game, this is where that data comes from. We're looking at about a 5-minute time to breach that occurred for them to be able to make entry as Cho was shooting. He had a 9mm, a Glock 19, and a Walther P22. While he was in Norris Hall, he was firing 1 round every 3.79 to 4.14 seconds that he was in there. While he was in a classroom, he averaged 1 shot per second with 1 gun in each hand, typically shooting from left to right in the classroom. There's a couple of heroes that don't really get the accolades they deserve. One is the kid that's on the left-hand side of the screen, and that is Matthew Laporte. He was an Air Force ROTC, part of the Corps of Cadets. That was the only student that fought back. That was in room 211. After eyewitness accounts, forensic data, the Air Force ended up awarding his family the Airman's Medal because of his actions on that day of charging Cho. Second hero is on your right-hand side of that screen, and that is Lavriscu. He is a 72-year-old Holocaust survivor who was the only one that readily recognized the sound of guns that day going off. As soon as he heard that, he closed the door to his room, which all the rooms were unable to be locked, so there was no lockdown capability in the case of Norris Hall. He leaned against that door and had all of his students jump 19 feet out the window into a bush and run. All of his students made it out alive except for one girl who didn't make it out before Cho shot through the door, taking Lavriscu out and killing her also. So there's a couple things to take home for that. Also is if we know people that are spouses that work in schools or with our kids and things like that, there's never been a case, if we look at Virginia Tech or we look at Beslan or any of those events, where people have escaped out that school, whether jumping out windows or out back doors or anything like that, where the threat has actually realized they left, chased after them, and tried to shoot them. Once they're out, that threat is owning that building. They're not going out and running after people that just jumped 19 feet down a window and are running across the drill field over there. They're letting them go. And in that case, I think lockdown is vitally important. There's a lot of different views on that, but I can't say lockdown shouldn't be the last step you do before you hide in that classroom if you have a secondary means of egress like a window. Lockdown should be what you do initially to slow that threat down and make sure you get everybody out if you have a means of egress and get out of there. If it was a fire in that building, right, we're not going to close those doors and hope the fire doesn't reach us before the firemen get there. That door needs to be fortified not only with the lock but with additional door chocks or anything like that. Wherever we see light, we put that door chock in there and hit it with a book, kick it with our foot, whatever it is to gain the best security we can in that door and try and get people out as quick as we possibly can. So going back to Virginia Tech on that day, the only reason I have the middle picture up is realize that the response to Norris Hall when Cho began shooting was much quicker than it normally would be, because he did kill two people, West Ambler Johnson, Emily Hilscher, and Ryan Clark. Earlier, about 2 hours before he attacked Norris Hall, he killed them in that building, and there was a lot more law enforcement and assets that were in that area that would normally not be there when he started shooting in Norris Hall 2 hours later. So the amount of people that were on scene and the response times are a little skewed due to him doing that 2 hours prior. So we need to keep that in mind when we look at the amount of people that responded and what assets were available when he did start shooting in Norris Hall. We know he chained those doors. We got a picture of it, fairly common weak chain that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot, and a master padlock. It was actually a brass one that's not case hardened, wasn't double toe. Those are the doors that he did. When you look in the upper right, that is on the second story of Norris Hall, in that foyer type area. To the right is Holden Hall, to the left is Norris Hall. In the middle picture there's a door. It's kind of hard to see. To the right, that was chained padlock. The one on the left is where the entry was made into the maintenance room, which was not chained or padlocked. Cho didn't have access to that. And then the door is the door that we've seen in a lot of pictures where officers and first responders are carrying the wounded out. And that was that main entrance that you kind of see on side one. Here's an example of the doors that were there. These are the doors that were there, and that bottom picture is the chain and padlock that were in there, and that's what kept our law enforcement officers out. And if we think about it, we don't do a lot of hasty breaching or training for our law enforcement officers. When Cho attacked in here, we'll get into this a little bit more, he planned on being in there a lot longer, right? He had a backpack that still had a bunch of ammo in it that was kind of pre-staged down the hallway by the bathroom. He planned on doing what he was doing, going around and without mercy murdering whoever was in that building on that second floor until law enforcement made entry. And then that was his time to stop. And that was his pre-planned idea, not too different than what we saw in the previous event 6 months earlier. So as soon as law enforcement was able to breach around that 5-minute mark into the maintenance room, anybody that's seen the cell phone video that was taken kind of catty corner to side 4 we'll remember that the shotgun breach occurred, went in, there was maintenance people, they were yelling, "Get down, get down, get down." That was on the first floor. At that time, Cho realized that they were inside the building, and they were approaching the stairwell to come up to the second story. The last audible shot that was fired was heard by officers that were right in between the first and second floor, running up the stairs. As soon as they got to the second floor, there was no more fire. They figured he had probably taken hostages and barricaded. They had no idea what had occurred, right? He could have been reloaded. He could have made a run for it. He barricaded. He took his life. That was his plan from the get-go on there. So when we look at that, a couple interesting stats on this is when we look at Norris Hall specifically, not West Ambler. West Ambler, both of those kids were transported that passed away. But when we look at Norris Hall directly, none of the kids, none of the occupants of that building that were found alive, treated and evacuated, died. None of them. So could there be improvement in their level of TECC or anything like that? Absolutely, right? We all can improve our games based on what our assets are and what our equipment is. And do we have tourniquets? Do we have to improvise them? Blah, blah, blah. But the take home is if that entry team happened to be all physicians or trauma surgeons or whatever, that wouldn't have changed the results at all. So if we find somebody that's been, in the case of Virginia Tech, many of the lethal shots on those that were killed were at very close range to the head. We're not saving them, right? If somebody has their portion of their central nervous system outside their body, that is a 0% survival rate on that. But if we look at that data of all those that were injured, that were found alive and evacuated, none died. How can we decrease mortality at this event? I think without really any real argument, we can say breaching. He killed himself as soon as they breached, and that was his plan. And we can go back to previous events in 2006 that point to that direction also. If we could shave 30 seconds off that breach time, depending on whether he was in a classroom or he was moving around the hall, we can correlate that data to approximately 6 to 8 kids that could have lived. So breaching now becomes a tactical medicine capability. It is a preventative tactical medicine treatment modality, if you will, where it has a direct correlation, and in this case, more than anything else, to lives saved. Yet, it's often overlooked. So the arguments will come out and be like, hey, man, I get it. Not everybody's going to kill themselves, though, once we breach. Got it, man. The problem is what breaching provides you in a case is a perturbation. It's you re-engaging their OODA loop, if you will. Because if you're able to breach, they fortified it. They have the run of the house until you get in. Once you get in, they now have decisions to make. It's either they make a run for it, they maybe barricade themselves and take hostages, or they're just ready to, have suicide by cop, as they say, and they just run towards you, wanting that gunfight. No matter what they choose, they are not doing what they were doing prior to you getting in. They don't have the run of the hall anymore. So by even creating that perturbation, you have changed their game plan. You've gotten into their OODA loop, if you will, of decision making. You have forced a decision on them at that point where they cannot go on doing what they were doing, which is highly advantageous. So that being said, we're going to finish up part 1 here and take a break. But keep in mind, at that point, breaching now should take a precedence, not only in all of our training and in access issues, but also realize that breaching, without a doubt, without argument, can be put into a medical capability as far as lives being saved.